recording here. And I'm going to introduce Anthony Kane. He is President and CEO of the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure in Washington, D.C., where he oversees the organization's overall operations and leads the development of the Envision framework for sustainable infrastructure. He is also a commissioner on the Washington, D.C. Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. And I'm going to stop there. If you want to know more about his background, it's all listed on our invitation. I'm going to hand it over to Anthony, who's going to speak to us today about Envision. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thank you, Haley. Thank you, everyone, for having me today. I'll just pull up my slides here quickly. And oh, there we go. Hopefully, Rebecca, is that coming through as the first slide?
Yes, I can see your presentation. And I can hear you.
Wonderful. Those are good. Both of those. Well, thank you, everyone. Again, it's good to be here. Just to give you a brief history of the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure and Envision. So we were created 12 years ago now through a collaboration of the American Society of Civil Engineers, as well as the American Public Works Association and the American Council of Engineering Companies. And they had really seen how transformative building rating systems like LEED had been on the architecture and building side. And they recognized the unique challenges and opportunities that infrastructure has and the need for us to have our own framework for looking at the sustainability of infrastructure. So they created ASCE, and then we partnered with the Zofnass Program for Sustainable Infrastructure at Harvard University to create Envision. And a lot of the work that, most of the work I should say, that ASCE does is around the Envision rating system. ASCE is a 501c3 research and education nonprofit, so the same designation as ASCE. We really see ourselves as a hub for the community to bring together all the different disciplines and professions that are needed in the delivery of more sustainable infrastructure. So this was also a great outcome of the partnership of ASCE, because while ASCE by its nature is around the profession of civil engineering, ASCE, through our work on sustainable infrastructure, can also be a home for other professions and disciplines that are involved in delivering projects. So while we certainly represent ASCE and the engineering community very strongly, we can reach out to other professions as well. But ASCE is a hub. Our membership includes over 270 AEC firms, 160 government agencies, and 50 academic institutions and universities. And so our goal is to identify where in the delivery of more sustainable infrastructure there are opportunities for consensus or collaboration or shared resources, and where those can lead to more efficiency, cost effectiveness, or better outcomes. So that's really what we target. And as I said, Envision is the key component of how we do that. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the ASCE report card, but just to underscore why we're doing what we're doing. We have this critical need in our country to improve our infrastructure, and I would say to improve that by delivering more sustainable and resilient infrastructure. And so certainly the new infrastructure bill is a great step forward, but again, if you know the details of the report card, the 1.2 trillion of the infrastructure bill is wonderful, but it actually doesn't come close to ASCE's shortfall for infrastructure investment. So a lot of investment is still needed. And this is a critical time as we look in the cycle of the aging and renewal of our infrastructure systems. There is just a really pressing need that we develop the infrastructure that is going to best serve us for the next 100 years and look towards sustainability and resilience in the future. And we can see, I call this slide the administration goals because of the recent infrastructure bills, but when you look at this, this is the same goals that many of our communities are facing. The need to tackle climate change and its impacts, our need to be more resilient, a need to address equity and social justice issues, to protect our environment, to protect our public health, especially in light of COVID, and to lead an economic recovery. Any one of those things would be a daunting challenge, but we have to do them all simultaneously. And the reality is that when you look at all of these, infrastructure is going to play a critical, if not primary, role in addressing every single one of these. And so I think there'll be more focus on how infrastructure is not only delivering the critical services that it needs to deliver, but how it's also helping to address these other issues. And tools like Envision can really help in that regard. So in that light, I like to talk about Envision as a common language. That's really what we're talking about. Sustainability is incredibly complex. Infrastructure, as we know, is incredibly complex. So when you're starting to talk about what is sustainable infrastructure, we need a consistent measuring stick. We need a consistent language, a common language around which we communicate and do what we do. There's a great Peter Drucker quote that we can't manage what we can't measure. And so while sustainability can be subjective, while we don't know all of the answers, Envision can provide that common measuring stick around which to work, around which to build our skills and capabilities, to build our knowledge and understanding, and to improve our performance project after project. So that's really our goal. And a unique aspect of Envision as it applies to all different types of infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, we have building rating systems like LEED. My background is actually in architecture, don't hold that against me. But when you look at the difference between buildings might look different, but in terms of their function, their systems, their construction and organization, they're a lot more alike than when you go to infrastructure and compare a wind farm to a water treatment facility to a bridge. Infrastructure has a greater variety of types and systems that are involved. And at the same time, infrastructure has a different focus. So while buildings are very internally focused, they're very contained, they have very clear boundaries. Infrastructure is different. Infrastructure is always part of a system. I talk about infrastructure as being more externally facing. It's not just about the space occupied by the infrastructure itself. It's about what that project is doing for the system, what it's doing for the network, what it's doing for the community and the region as a whole. And so in Envision, you'll see the principles of sustainability very closely aligned with other sustainability rating systems or other sustainability guidelines and goals. But the how they are structured and how are they presented focus on the unique aspects of infrastructure and how infrastructure, the purpose of infrastructure, is to improve our communities, to protect our environments, to grow our economies, and addressing those issues in that light. And, I think I always have this slide about cost. One of the biggest walls you're going to bump into, if you haven't already on numerous occasions, is the perception that sustainability costs more. I argue very adamantly against that. I think, as we all know, this project management chart about our ability to make changes over a project timeline versus the cost increasing to make those changes. We are still in a phase where often sustainability is viewed as a nice to have or as an add-on. And so as a result, we're largely designing, often I should say, not always, we're often designing conventional projects and then making a decision somewhere late in the process as to whether we are going to add in some sustainability features or not. And if that's the approach, then yes, sustainability is going to cost more because, again, we're just designing a conventional project and then we're gluing some sustainability things on at the end. But Envision really encourages an approach that embeds sustainability from the very beginning. So if we are thinking and talking about sustainability issues from the earliest conception of the project and looking at how we can creatively and innovatively embed those into the project, we can achieve a sustainable project that doesn't necessarily cost more than a conventional project. The example I like to give, again, because of my architecture background, is ADA accessibility. When that first started, there were the same arguments that making buildings accessible to everyone would cost more, would drive up the cost of projects. But then it just became how we design buildings. And now nobody talks about accessibility as being more expensive. So, and sorry, Rebecca, I'm getting some notices about, I think the attendees, but I assume you'll take care of those. So cost in sustainability, when you really think about the principles of sustainability, it is about conserving our resources, protecting our environment, protecting our communities, achieving the best possible outcome with the least consumption of resources and space. And so when you look at it in that light, sustainability in the long run and sustainable projects in the long run are going to be more efficient, more cost effective. Now, you might bump into situations, especially when we look at multi-benefit projects, where it may have a higher initial cost, but it's also delivering a much higher value. And then that becomes a communication challenge around how we demonstrate that the return on investment, the value for money of these sustainable projects is in fact so much greater than a conventional project that might have a lower initial capital cost, but also a lower value overall. And so Envision is really a toolbox. We have our guidance manual, which is the heart and soul of Envision, but we also have a pre-assessment checklist. This is to that point I mentioned of embedding sustainability early in a project. We've basically distilled all of the Envision criteria into simple yes or no questions. So very early on in a project, you can run through the checklist in a couple hours and determine, whether you're addressing all the different sustainability indicators in Envision and how you're performing. We also have our professional training. This is the Envision Sustainability Professional, and you may see people with the ENVSP after their name. And we also have a third-party project and verification award, similar to other award programs that you may be familiar with, where projects go through a third-party review and then they receive either a silver, gold, platinum award. And I don't really have time today, since this is just an introduction to Envision, to go through all the nuts and bolts. But just to give you a highlight of the structure of Envision, it covers 5 categories that address the quality of life. These are the social and community impacts. Leadership, where again, with the unique challenges of infrastructure, we look at collaboration, planning, as well as the economic benefits of the project. Resource allocation is probably the one you're more familiar with, where we just look at trying to be as efficient as possible with materials, energy, and water. In natural world, we're looking at those environmental impacts and conservation and ecology. And then in climate and resilience, we have kind of 2 sections, one on climate change and mitigating climate change through emissions, and then a bigger section focusing on resilience and how we prepare for not only changing climate, but changing conditions, social conditions, economic conditions. Resilience is really about designing projects that recognize that all of these different social, environmental, and economic factors are changing. And I don't expect you to read this slide, but this is how the different categories unfold into the 64 indicators, or credits as we call them, and many of them addressing the critical issues of today that I've highlighted. So enhancing public health and safety is a credit. Equity and social justice is a credit. There are an entire subcategory on economic development, where we look at stimulating economic prosperity, developing local skills and capabilities, as well as life cycle economic evaluations. So not only life cycle cost evaluations, but the value of the project overall. And then, of course, climate change and resilience as well. And so as far as the structure of the credits themselves, within each credit, you have 5 levels of achievement. And this is just one portion of a credit. Each credit has multiple pages explaining what it's about, how you meet the criteria. But just to show you, a critical aspect of Envision is we don't just draw an arbitrary line in the sand and say, if you do this, you're sustainable, and if you don't do this, you're not sustainable. Sustainability is a spectrum, and we always want to be more sustainable. So we lay out these 5 different levels of achievement, and as you can kind of see in the graph, they build by adding requirements as you go up. And so wherever you are in your project and wherever you are in your organization's sustainability journey, you can identify where you're at, and maybe the limitations of the project or your abilities to make changes put you on one of the lower levels. That's fine. But you can see the higher levels, and you can see how on future projects or through future programmatic changes, you can get to higher levels of achievement. Another key element is, if you look at the 4th level from the left, the conserving level, that's our net zero or zero impact level. And then beyond that is our restorative level. So Envision always tries to imagine a scenario where it's not only about doing less harm or doing less bad, but really the reason we're building infrastructure is to improve our communities. And so there are opportunities for restorative levels to show how you are righting a past wrong, fixing a previous problem, improving an environment or restoring an environment that was previously damaged, how you're providing these restorative elements into your projects. And that's a critical element of Envision. I've already mentioned how I really view it, the value of it as a common language, but what we also hear from project teams that have gone through the third-party verification process is that it's also just a good project management tool. It's a good project delivery tool. When you think about what sustainability is and how we do it, it requires a lot of early communication, getting people in the team together, get them talking, get them thinking about challenges and issues that will happen further along in the project, again, in terms of environmental and social impacts, get them more engaged with stakeholders. All of those things ultimately just result in better projects and in a better project delivery. So it's been really exciting to hear that a lot of people who use Envision find these other benefits in addition to the higher sustainability performance of the projects themselves. And through the collaboration, they also find that it leads to a lot of innovative solutions. I have a lot of anecdotal stories where, again, because they went through the Envision review process, incorporated it early in the project and started having those conversations, things that they thought maybe would cost more or things that they thought they wouldn't be able to do on a project, by getting those different perspectives in and asking them, they were able to come up with innovative solutions and do things that they didn't necessarily know. There was one recent example I was given of a project manager who was actually not in favor of using Envision, didn't really understand why it needed to be done, and said, this was for a bridge replacement project, a small bridge. And he said, this project is just a standard bridge replacement. And in fact, it's only going to be short term because we know in the future we're going to have to replace this bridge again for growth reasons. They were replacing it for safety issues, but it was going to have to be, at some point in the future, it turned into a larger bridge. And someone said, well, in Envision, we have a credit on, the end of life of the project and increasing the value. And is there a way, if we know that a new bridge is going to be coming in the future, what can we do on the design of this bridge in order to make and to facilitate that? And so they were able to increase the sizing, I believe, of the embankments and support systems so that when the next bridge came along, it would be in a better position and save money in terms of the project. So that's just one example of many of how having these conversations can lead to more innovative solutions and ultimately cost savings down the road. This is just a quick distribution of the Envision verified projects across the country. And I would say we don't necessarily advocate that every project needs to go through the third-party verification. So, while this shows a great distribution of projects all over the country, it's a small proportion of the total projects and the total owners who are using Envision on their projects. These are just the verified ones. And here I just zoom in on your region. They're a little bit stacked up in the Grand Rapids area. There's two in Holland. One is a registered project that's undergoing review right now. And the other one, I should say it's registered to go under review. And the other one underneath it is a verified project in Holland for their energy park. But these are some of the projects in your area. And so Envision has been used to rate over $106 billion worth of infrastructure to date. That's about 110 projects. There are 6,000 active credentialed ENVSPs, predominantly in the United States, but we do operate in a few countries around the world. And as I mentioned, about 160 public agencies. This includes sometimes cities, counties, airport authorities, seaports, things like that. And here I'll be shifting into just how we see Envision being used in practice more. So these are some of the largest public agencies that are using Envision, and I've included the number of ENVSPs on staff because, as you can see, 231 in LA County. The credential is not just about having the ability to put a project through the third-party verification, which may be why people pursue the credential in other rating systems or building rating systems. But really in Envision, as I mentioned, it's about providing that common language, that training around a consistent approach to sustainability. And so many of the public agencies use the ENVSP training as a skills and capacity knowledge development tool to bring large numbers of people up to speed on how to make more sustainable infrastructure. Again, a unique aspect of infrastructure versus buildings is on the building side, you might have a sustainability specialist or one person who's responsible for incorporating sustainability. Infrastructure really involves many different teams, many different organizations. The more people that you have trained and aware of how Envision works and how to apply it on projects, the better the outcome is going to be rather than just putting it in the hands of one person. So this, I just highlight the difference between the ENVSP credential and other credentials you may be familiar with. It's really about building that base knowledge. And so here, just walking through some of the interesting ways that Envision is being applied across the country, kind of from top-down levels. Last year, we had the first state bill. This one doesn't affect your region, but it's in California. I use this because I'm hoping that it's a model for future bills. So as we all know, there's a unique challenge for us between wanting to preserve strong regulations that protect our environment and our communities, while at the same time not wanting to slow down projects through permitting and approvals and delay the delivery of important infrastructure that's going to help us. And so California had an interesting solution where they have even stricter regulations through their CEQA review process, but they streamlined the judicial review process for transit projects if those projects can demonstrate that they are, quote unquote, environmental in nature. And one of the ways that they demonstrate that is through the use of Envision. So we can have the strong regulations that prevent bad projects from getting through and harming the environment or communities, but we can also streamline and speed up the delivery of those projects that we know are going to have positive impacts. Here we have resolutions at the city and county level, often adopting Envision. So again, Miami-Dade County Board of Commissioners. We also have LA City, LA County, who have passed similar resolutions. St. Petersburg is a suburb community of Tampa in Florida. They actually passed a city ordinance requiring Envision on all infrastructure projects over $3 million, I believe. And so this has been great because there are many cities or communities in the country that have requirements for sustainable buildings, or that buildings go through a certification process. And Envision kind of fills the gap so that now we can require the same level of care and standard for infrastructure as well as buildings. I do get asked often if Envision is tied to funding. Because ISI is an independent nonprofit, we don't have many examples of it being tied specifically to funding. But this is one again that I hope to repeat, which is the California Department of Water Resources Flood Management Division. This is a great model because the Flood Management Division has a very specific area of regulatory control on flood management projects. But they recognize that, rather than having a one problem, one solution approach, if these flood management projects took a multi-benefit or more holistic approach through sustainability, it would deliver greater benefits to the state of California. So the department issues an additional 5% or 10% grant funding if projects can achieve Envision Gold or Platinum. And to me, this makes sense, and it's an easily replicable process in many other states where, again, we can break out of the silos of these regulatory controls and recognize that we want to design projects that are holistically beneficial to our communities. And even if it's a flood management project, it can have so many other benefits and values, and that deserves additional funding. And we did have a project that went through this process, I should say, last year, and it was a smaller project, but I believe they received an additional $500,000 worth of funding as a result of their Envision rating. We also see Envision popping up in RFPs. So sometimes you'll see it at different levels. The lowest level is just requiring a credentialed person be included in the project. Sometimes then we'll see that they'll require an ENVSP and have them do a self-assessment of the project, and then the owner will make the final decision as to whether they want to go through the third-party verification. Or sometimes if the owner is already a kind of seasoned Envision user, they'll just issue the RFP saying that the ENVSP has to be involved, and that the consultant will push the project through the verification process. We see different approaches to verification. Sometimes an owner will outsource the entire verification process to a consultant. Sometimes the owner will do the process entirely in-house. Sometimes they'll split. So there isn't one specific way between the owner-consultant relationship as to how they pursue verification. This was an interesting one where even if you have an owner or someone who has a pre-existing sustainability plan, this is the New York City Department of Design and Construction. They've been focused on sustainability for a very long time, but they looked at Envision because they recognized that this was a national system, a consensus-based system. It would have a different approach. So they compared different typologies of their standard projects and all of the policies in place of how to deliver those projects and how a typical project would stack up using Envision. So here you can see on the left the 5 different categories of quality of life all the way to climate and resilience within Envision. And then in white, these would be points that the projects would just inherently achieve as a result of the standard policies, regulations, design guidelines that the department uses. And then in yellow, they looked at, or I should say in green, they looked at minimal effort changes that they could make to achieve more points in Envision. And then, yellow, more impact, red, more effort needed to make those changes. And so it was a really nice way for them to kind of assess where they were. As you can see, they were doing very well in quality of life and all of the social aspects of the project, but they were doing very little on the climate change and resilience side. And then it helped them kind of develop a strategy on how they were going to improve, because again, the chart very clearly shows they're doing really well in community and quality of life impacts, and any additional increases there would actually be quite a bit of effort, whereas there seems to be a lot of low-hanging fruit in the leadership and climate and resilience categories. So here, if you're just interested in more of the details, the way they broke it down was green as least effort is things that they're kind of already doing, but they're just not documenting or would require a minor change into how they operate to achieve the credits. Yellow would require sort of a policy change at the department level. So it would be above the ability of the project itself to change, but the department could make that change. And then red is something that would be prohibited or not, they're not able to do it as a result of a policy or something above the department itself. So maybe it's the city or the state requires something and the DDC can't actually make that change on their own, but they could potentially, send up the chain that would be helpful. So that's how they evaluated at this portfolio level. And finally, here on this series of slides, improving design guidelines. And the example I love to give is actually the second one of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The Port Authority actually had their own sustainable infrastructure guideline system that predated Envision, but they recognized that they were a couple years ago that it was 10 years old and that they were going to have to update it and put in all that time and effort. And they realized that and ultimately decided to just scrap their own custom design guidelines and adopt Envision. They wrote a kind of 20-page bolt-on to just show how Envision would be applied specifically on Port Authority projects and in their procedures and processes. And when I asked them kind of what led them to that decision, they recognized that it was an investment on their part to develop these custom guidelines, to continue to update them, improve them, and all they ever would have is the manual, the 180-page manual that they would give to their employees. Whereas by adopting Envision, one, they saved all of that time and effort, but then they were able to latch on to the training and credentialing program, the continuing education opportunities. They became part of a network of organizations and people using Envision, and so they would be able to tap into other ports and authorities that are using Envision and learn from how they're doing things. So they really saw the benefit there. And I just highlight that story because it really hits at why ISI exists, again, as a nonprofit. Our goal is to provide these shared resources so that we don't have 1,000 slightly different versions of sustainability and sustainable infrastructure, and that all of these organizations don't have to spin their wheels reinventing the wheel around sustainability. And all of that time and effort can go into just making the projects more sustainable, rather than defining what sustainability means today. So in the last few minutes, I'll just hit a few example projects that have used Envision, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. So please feel free to prepare some questions. This is the historic Fourth Ward Park before in Atlanta. As you can see, I believe it was a brownfield site. It was an illegal dumping area. Really not a great place. And as you can probably tell from the topography, a low-lying area that was prone to flooding and had many issues. And this is what it was turned into. And I'll actually flip back and forth really quickly. You can see in the background those buildings on the hill. And then, here they pop up again. So a really beautiful transformation. And this is a great example of those types of multi-benefit projects that I mentioned. And we're seeing a big trend in Envision-rated projects that multi-benefit projects seem to be the path of the future and a really great way of approaching sustainability. So this is a flooding and a stormwater management project. But what they did was they recognized the need to really transform this neighborhood. They provided this beautiful park. This is what the community sees and experiences, but it's also providing a very critical service in terms of the infrastructure itself. And I think by layering those values and components into projects, we bring infrastructure back into the heart of our communities, and we don't hide it. We don't put it underground. We don't send it, outside and into the periphery. We bring infrastructure back into the center of our communities, and we make the public appreciate infrastructure. And I think that's been many of our, not to get on a soapbox, but many of our funding challenges, the challenges that we have getting people to care about infrastructure and focus on infrastructure, is that for decades, engineers have been told to hide it, to put it out of sight, and you're so good at your jobs that everyone has forgotten about it and they don't see it anymore. So I think these projects are great examples of how we can bring, again, infrastructure back into the hearts of our communities, make them see it again, make them see and appreciate what it's doing. And they may not fully understand all of the stormwater and flood management issues that are going on here, but they can see and appreciate the community value that's being brought. And we have a number of those project examples. This is the Kansas City streetcar. This was a great example of the economic benefits that infrastructure brings. They did a study and have followed up with that study on just a huge economic development corridor that was created in Kansas City as a result of this streetcar. And so there, I think, again, helping us tell the story of economic growth, of community revitalization that happens as a result of these infrastructure projects. It's not just about providing the service. It's, in this case, it's not just about moving people and how many people get moved. This streetcar has transformed the commercial center and heart of this city, which has so many additional benefits and values beyond just the service that it's providing. This is LaGuardia Airport replacement, a multi-billion-dollar project using Envision. I would say we see projects from multi-billion-dollar projects all the way down to $4 or $5 million projects that use Envision. I would say if you're using Envision, Envision can certainly be applied and be helpful to any project. The principles can be applied. If you're looking at projects, I usually say kind of under $3 million. You may want to look critically at whether the third-party verification is useful. At that point, you're sometimes talking about really small projects, and in which case the effort involved in the documentation and the review may not be worthwhile. But certainly using Envision as a self-assessment tool can provide a lot of benefits to the project. And finally, this is the California High-Speed Rail project. I just highlight this because we're very proud. It's the largest infrastructure project in the United States currently, $80 billion. It went through the Envision review process, and it's just off the charts on so many levels. The focus on environmental protections, carbon reductions, community and economic development. So we were really excited to be involved in this project. And so just as next steps, before we go into Q&A, if you are interested in learning more about Envision, you can go to sustainableinfrastructure.org and create an account. It's entirely free. This is what your dashboard looks like. Down at the bottom there, you can download the Envision manual, the whole manual. That's also free. We have it in a few different languages. You can download the checklist as well. There are options if you did want to become an Envision sustainability professional. That does include fees based off of whether you're a government or a private sector person. But so if you did want to become an ENVSB, and if your company is a member, you can also already connect. Membership is free for public agencies. There is a fee for private companies. But I also want to highlight, since this is the West Michigan branch, ASCE, we also have a partnership with ASCE to offer Envision training through their education platform. So the next one that's coming up is April 25th and 26th. It's 2 afternoons. You can register through ASCE through your mylearning.asce.org, and I have provided the link here. After I close out the presentation, I'll try to also copy that into the chat, and I'd of course be happy to send my slides as well if that would be helpful, but you can certainly find it through mylearning.asce.org. So ISI is really excited to be working with ASCE on this, and as ASCE members, you get a discount if you go through through this option that's even more discounted than than the standard ISI pricing. So that's a great opportunity as well. And with that, I really appreciate your time. And that's the end. Oh, sorry, that was just a thank you slide at the end. I'll stop sharing and we can switch over to Q&A.
Thank you, Anthony. That was a wonderful presentation. I hope I'll pause for a minute and let people ask any questions.
This is Paul Elzinga. Do you hear me?
Yes.
I hear you, Paul.
I just want to mention the Holland BPW, 2 Envision projects. The first one would have been the Holland Energy Park. And right now, the one that's going on is the anaerobic digester. Both are Envision worthy. And there's a lot online that you can read about how they were applicable. Anthony, anything you might want to add about those 2 projects by chance?
Those 2 projects were wonderful. Yes, the Holland Energy project, really exciting. It's actually featured in our version 3 of the Envision manual. We have a call out for the Holland project. So there, I just would say it was a great example as well that they had a award ceremony for the project. ISI staff went out and supported that. And so there's also those great moments to highlight success stories. I think probably all of us have been involved too many times where infrastructure doesn't get enough attention when we do things right, which people don't appreciate is 99.999% of the time. And so Envision also provides a great opportunity for us to do a little celebration, to shine a spotlight on when we have these wonderful projects that are delivering such great value. So that's great. And I'm really excited about the anaerobic digester. ISI policy is that we don't talk about projects that are in the process of going through Envision review. But Paul, as you mentioned, there's a lot of information online that you can get on both of those projects. So I'm glad. It sounds like you were involved in them, so I'm glad.
Well, I was on the board at the time, and it was a lot of fun. I was at the celebration. And the other thing is that HDR, of course, had a lot to do with that. They were the owner's representative on the power plant, the energy park, and Donovan is working on the digester at this point in time.
Wonderful.
In fact, my nephew Peter Elzinga works for Davis, who's the contractor on the digester. So it warms my heart. I wish we had a picture of the before and after of the site of the energy park. But 70, derelict places that were replaced, and it's the gateway to Holland now.
Yeah, I've seen the photos of the new facility, and it's beautiful. I mean, again, it's a great example of making infrastructure something that people want to see, that they want to go to and participate in. And I think that's the trend, and I'm really excited about that.
Another firm involved was Progressive. Progressive worked with HDR on the architectural and the fact that it is now one of a kind in the nation. Thanks.
Of course, thank you. And while we're waiting for any more questions, I did just post the link to the ASCE My Learning page. So hopefully that if those of you who are interested in going through ASCE for ENBSP training, please do. And I see it from Melanie.
Yeah, I can read it out. Melanie says, can you describe a typical team of professionals required that can make an Envision certified project successful?
Great question. In a way, there's no sort of one approach. We see it many different ways. As I mentioned, sometimes it's through the consultant. As Paul mentioned, they brought on HDR to lead that process. Sometimes it's kind of a hybrid approach. I would say lessons learned, as I mentioned in the presentation, it's a little bit different from if you're familiar with lead process or something like that, where you might have one designated, lead AP who's going to lead the whole thing. Because infrastructure projects are so complex, you have so many different teams, and because Envision hits on so many different areas, it can be challenging if only one person is responsible for tracking all of that documentation down, and only one person is really familiar with Envision. So we do find that it's valuable to have large groups of the project team at least made aware of what Envision is and what the requirements are and how it works so that they can be more supportive when whoever is preparing the documentation comes to them and says, you know, here's what I'm looking for. They have a better sense of what's needed and how to provide that in an efficient way. Otherwise, it's a lot of just digging and research for that one person, and it can result in some wasted time. So I would say, you know, the more people on the team that are involved, the better. We have had some great success where ISI will also offer sort of like a group ENVSP training for an entire team around a specific project. And that can be fun sometimes too, because you can kind of make it a rollout. They get the training all together. You can even use the project that they're working on as a lot of the examples in the training class and things like that. So that's one option. I'm getting a little off topic, but yeah, so there's not really a single makeup of that team, but I would say you do need a team that's going to lead the documentation process, whether that's the owner or the consultant. And the more people involved in the project who have that Envision general knowledge, the better.
I have a question. I like to pause for a second to see if anyone else does. Does ISI consult with agencies when they update their guidelines to meet Envision's goals? Do you do that consultation service?
We don't provide any kind of consultation services, but I'm always happy to if that was ever of interest. You know, I'd say it's an open door for any owner to contact us and see. I'd be happy to share what we know. In many cases, it's not really us. I think, you know, in a way, the first slide where I talk about ISI as a hub, you know, it's really not ISI developing things and then pushing it out into the industry. Often our job is to really be a clearinghouse and to share information and to bring things together. So if owners come to us and say, hey, we're thinking about changing our guidelines or something like that, what I can do is often put them in touch with other owners and agencies that have already done that. I can give them examples of language and what's been done in different ways and help them out in that way. So I think that's really the goal or the role that we provide. We're not really consultants as a nonprofit, but we can be a facilitator.
Gotcha.
And I would put that out as just an open invitation, just like today. I'm always happy if through your companies or the organizations that you work for, agencies that you work for, if you'd like to learn more about Envision, a similar presentation as today, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my contact information in the chat. I'm always happy to give additional presentations on Envision and, you know, just help you work through whether it's something of interest. I would definitely encourage downloading the manual and just kicking the tires by flipping through that. I think most people who look through the manual find it really helpful. But please feel free to reach out to me at any time if you want to learn more.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to wait for one more second in case anyone else has burning questions. But it sounds like they're eating lunch right now, so I'm going to stop the recording here.